This morning we'll continue our series in 1 Samuel. We'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 25 today. And we pick up with David, and he's still on the run. He's on the run from King Saul, who is murderous, who wants to kill him. And there's no negotiation left. He's on the run. And I think when we think about David on the run, if we think about this story in general, and we think about the arc of it and everything like that, we think of David on his own. Right? We think of him as like a lone ranger out there fleeing from the evil king, but he's not alone. He has, in fact, 600 men with him in his company, 600 men that have joined up with him, and these men are described earlier as being those who are in distress, those who are in debt, and those who are bitter in soul, who've just given up on life. So a real ragtag group. Right, it sets up for a really rough group of guys. Most of them are soldiers. They probably know David from being in the army with him and having him as their commander, and they've fled to him. Right, they've given up on Saul. They've given up on the ordinary way of things. That they're going with David, and they're all living together on the run, trying to make it work. Right, but one of the big questions is, how is David going to feed all these guys? Right, what are they going to do to survive? And so, in our story today, we find that they've picked up a job that they're well qualified for. They're going to be doing private security. Right? They're providing private security. They're qualified for it. They're soldiers. This is something that they can do. And so they take up a job at private security for a very rich man named Nabal. And we'll pick up with this story in verses 1 through 17 first. It says this: Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, and the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to his young men, Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing at all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, Every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. About 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm. We did not miss a thing when they were in the fields, as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us, both night and by day. All the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. So we find out first, and just in passing in verse 1, that Samuel died, which is really strange in a book that's named after him, and that we still have a long way to go in, right? But he dies in the middle of the book that's named after him, and there's actually a whole second book, right? 2 Samuel. He's dead for the whole thing. So Samuel dies, and it's mentioned pretty briefly because he hasn't been a major player in our story in a while. The last thing we saw was when David fled to him at Ramah and kind of joined his revival, and he was protected there. He likely learned some things from Samuel. But what I want us to note as we think about Samuel and his story coming to an end here is that he fulfilled the promise that his mother made, the vow that his mother made before he was even born. If we think back to 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11, this is Hannah, and it says that Hannah, she vowed a vow and said, "O Yahweh of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, will give your servant a son, then I will give him to Yahweh all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head." She promised to give her son to God all the days of his life, and that he would take the vow of the Nazarite. That's part of that. That's why he's not going to have a razor touch his head. And sure enough, Samuel served God all the days of his life. And so we can imagine that at the end of his life, he had very long hair. But he fulfilled the promise that his mother made him. Now, we move on to David. It says that David and his men, they go down to this place called Maon, and they meet this man named Nabal. Nabal lived in Maon, but he had business in Carmel. It seems that he kind of raised his sheep and goats in Maon, but then he had to go up to Carmel to shear them and sell the wool. Maon seems to be a kind of a wilderness area. Carmel was maybe a center of business. And so he's there to sell the wool, and he's very rich. He's a very rich man. He's got 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He's a Calebite, which is just telling us of his genealogy, that he's descended from Caleb, who was one of the spies that first checked out the promised land, one of the good ones. And so he's got a good heritage, but he's got a good wife, right? He's married to Abigail, who's described as discerning and beautiful, but he himself is described as being harsh and badly behaved. Wife, discerning and beautiful, man, harsh and badly behaved, describes a lot of marriages, frankly. But that's the situation, right? This is who Nabal is. He's a rich man. He's not a good man. And again, that's a common tale. And David goes to work for him. He's protecting the sheep and everything. It seems that there was always a lot of loss whenever Nabal was gone shearing the sheep. The shepherds that remained would lose probably sheep. They would lose other property and things like that. And so David and his men, they come and guard the sheep and all of Nabal's possessions while he's up working in Carmel. He's providing this private security to him. And he hears that the sheep shearing time has come, right? They've got the shearers up in Carmel. They're shearing the sheep. They're selling wool. They're making profit. And they're even preparing now for a feast. They're going to have a feast celebrating. This was common in those days. Whenever your crop came in, or in this case, your product, the wool, whenever that came in and you sold it all, then it was time to have a big feast. And so he's throwing a big feast for himself and his men there. And David thinks to himself, well, this is the time for me to ask for payment. Because they didn't make they're not going to be paid with like paychecks and things like that. They're going to get paid when the money comes in, which is at the shearing time. And so David sends his young men to Carmel to ask for payment. And he instructs them to make the request for payment with great respect. Right? He wishes him peace. He defines what's been done. Hey, we protected all of your stuff. You didn't lose anything. He provides proof of service, right? He says, you can ask your servants, ask your young men how it went, and they'll tell you, right? So they can testify to it. They go with them to provide proof of service. And then they request payment in whatever was most convenient, right? He doesn't even ask specifically for what he wants. He says, whatever you have on hand, whatever's convenient for you, send that as payment. Because you can imagine David and his men, they're surviving out here, and they're likely, hunting game and things like that, and getting by, but supplies are running low. They need food, they need all the things that they need to survive. And so he's asking, hey, it's time for payment. You have money, now's the time to pay me. And Nabal's response is very offensive, right? He pretends to have never heard of David. He goes, who's David? Oh, you're from David? Who's David? Oh, the son of Jesse. Who's the son of Jesse? I don't know who this guy is. He probably pretended to work for me. He makes this whole thing up about I don't know anything about this situation. I don't owe him anything. Should I give my my bread and my meat and my everything away to someone that I don't know. Right? And that's the offense that he gives to David, and he turns his men away empty-handed. And so his men come back and report this to David, and you can see on your map, Maon and Carmel, they're not far apart. This isn't a great journey. His men come back and tell him, hey, he turned us away. He pretended that he never heard of you. And David is incensed. And he does the natural thing for a soldier to do, and a soldier especially with an army. And he says, every man strap on your sword. Get your swords on. Get armed up. We're going to take care of business. Right? This is the most natural thing for him and for his men. They're not going to blink twice at this. They have no problem taking this risk. Remember, these guys are in distress, in debt, bitter in soul. They have no problem doing some major violence. Right? If this is a movie, this would be the moment we get the, set in modern times, this is where we get the montage of like guns being strapped on and clips being put in and, armor, bullets and stuff being put on and men, checking tanks and things like that. Like they're getting armed up. They're ready to go. Engines revving, right? They're ready to go and take care of business here and right this wrong. But one of Nabal's servants, he can see what's going to happen, right? He goes, this is a bad situation. And so he goes and warns Abigail. He goes to Nabal's wife and says, you got to understand what your husband just did. He just made a huge mistake. He put all of us at risk. He even testifies to her that David and his men did good to them. And he notes that they didn't suffer loss when they were in the fields. He warns Abigail because David and his men would kill Nabal and his whole family and everybody that works for him. He knows that this offense has put them all at risk. And he's been with David and his men. He knows how rough these guys are. He knows how hard these dudes are, that they can take care of business. In response, and in telling her this, he talks about Nabal in this way. He says, this is what Nabal did, and that he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. Right, there's a lot of problems with Nabal, right? He's obviously a swindler. We know that he's harsh. We know that he's badly behaved. But the thing that this servant notes as being the thing that makes him a worthless man is that he cannot be reasoned with. He won't listen to advice. He won't listen to good advice. He won't see reason. You cannot speak to him in this way. And this really points out, and the rest of the story is going to really highlight for us how important it is for us to be able to listen to good advice. Right? We need to be able to listen to good advice. It is something that the Scripture speaks of in the wisdom literature. So in Proverbs chapter 12:15, it says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. Proverbs 19, verse 20, listen to advice and accept instruction that you may gain wisdom in the future. And Ecclesiastes 4:13, better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. That last passage even emphasizes and shows us how it's possible to lose the ability to take advice, right? What does he contrasts this poor, wise youth, right? He says you have a poor youth, a young man, doesn't have any money, doesn't have any experience, doesn't have anything going for him. He's willing to listen to advice. He's wise. He can listen to advice. He can improve his situation. But you might have an old king, and he's already achieved, right? He's already on the top of his game. He's, in our day, there's somebody who's a CEO or highly successful in their business, and they've got lots of money, and they've got everything they need, and he's forgotten how to take advice. He won't listen to anyone. Right? What's the difference between those two men? Humility. Right? The poor man is humble. The rich man is not. He's willing to see, hey, maybe I don't have all the answers. It's important that we remain humble and that we remain willing and able and ready to take good advice, which we'll see if David does here in this next section, verses 18 through 35. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep, already prepared, and 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, "Go on before me, behold, I come after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under a cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, "Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. God, do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. Now then, my lord, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, because Yahweh has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. For Yahweh will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of Yahweh, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of Yahweh your God. And the lives of all your enemies shall be sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when Yahweh has done to my lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you and has appointed you prince over Israel, my lord shall have no cause for grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my lord working salvation himself. And when Yahweh has dealt well with my lord, then remember your servant." And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." So Abigail wisely assembles her own payment for David without consulting her husband. Right? She gets 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, it's about 80 liters, 5 butchered sheep, a bunch of grain, raisins, figs. She gets all this stuff together. I tried to kind of do the math, figure out how much this might be. It's somewhere around $10,000 to $15,000. So a pretty good payment for this work. And she brings it to David. And David, she meets him on the way, and he's full of this anger. He's ready to threaten Nabal. And she tells him his threat. Like, "I'm not going to leave one male alive. That's how much I'm going to wipe out everybody in his house." This would be a lot of men, by the way, for a man this rich. It means all of his sheep shearers, all of his shepherds, all of his sons, anybody that lived, any relatives of his that live with him, he's going to kill all of them. So when Abigail sees David, she falls at his feet and she begs David to hear her out. She admits to David that her husband is a worthless fellow. She knows he's worthless in this way for the same reason that it was pointed out, that he won't listen to advice. He won't listen to the advice of his wife. She knew she couldn't go and reason with him. She had to take matters into her own hands. And a man ought to listen to reason, especially from his wife, as we're told in Proverbs 19, verse 14. "House and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from Yahweh." Nabal won't see that. He won't listen to her. And we can see that Abigail is being quite prudent. You might argue that she's being offensive to her husband by talking about him in this way, right? She even says this line of, "As his name is, so is he." As his name is, so is he. And what she's saying there, the reason she says that is because Nabal means fool. She's saying he's a fool, just like his name. His name is fool. and he is a fool. And you might say she's being offensive there, but we have to remember she's trying to save his life. Or she's actually being quite kind to him by saving his life in this way. But he is a fool. She sees that. She admits that to David. As his name is, so is he. And it does give us, I think the fact that his name is Fool gives me some compassion for the guy. You know, like, his parents couldn't have been that great. You know what I mean? Like, if you're naming your kid Fool, you're not very, that can't be a very good parents. Right? And so he maybe had a rough upbringing, maybe. But it still doesn't excuse the fact that he won't listen to advice. He won't listen to his wife. He's a fool, just like his name. And so Abigail, she takes the blame on herself, right? She says, the guilt can be on me. Please forgive me. Let me take the guilt on. Let me make up for this. And then she also gives David good advice, right? She says, recognize that by God sending me, he's restrained you from blood guilt. I'm coming to stop you, and that's stopping you from working salvation with your own hand. She says that over and over again. He shouldn't be working salvation with his own hand. He should be trusting God to avenge these things for him. And she encourages him. She essentially tells him, like, you're too important for this. She knows who he is. She knows all about him. Whether by reputation or perhaps they had some conversation when he was getting hired or whatever it is, certainly his reputation is big in Israel. And she says, you're too important for this. You're fighting God's battles. You shouldn't be fighting this battle. You go fight God's battles. Let God deal with these things for you. You don't need to deal with this. And that's what David has done so far, but here he is broken off from that, right? David has been doing that. Think about how he dealt with Saul. He's wise enough to know, hey, Saul is something that God's got to deal with, right? He refuses to even kill Saul when he has him in a cave with his back turned to him. I mean, he's listening and obeying God in all these other ways, but here his desire for revenge, his offense at what Nabal has done has just gotten his blood up, and he is ready to go and kill. And she here tells him, like, no, this is not who you are. You're too important for this. She tells David all the good that will happen if he spares Nabal. Right? It says, if men rise up to pursue you, in verse 29, it says, if men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound up in the bundle of the living in the care of Yahweh your God. The image that she creates here, she says, like, the fact that if you show mercy here and you spare human life, it will be as though when people come and get you, there will be living people surrounding you, protecting you because of who you have spared. They will be protecting you. It's like you'll be bound up in a whole group of people. There'll be people surrounding you, binding you in and protecting you in that moment. And I think she means that both literally and figuratively. Right? Literally in the sense that when David spares Nabal, he's not just sparing Nabal, who doesn't deserve to be spared, frankly. But what did he say? He said he's going to kill there's going to be not left one male in his house. He's going to kill all of the men in Nabal's house. That's not just his family members, that's also his servants, including this guy, including the guy that came to Nabal to tell him, came to Abigail to warn her about this worthless fellow who can't be reasoned with. That's why he's doing that. He's going to Abigail because he's trying to save his own life. He doesn't want to be mixed up with Nabal. So if David listens to her here, she's saying, all of those men are going to know that their lives were saved because you showed mercy. So that in the end, when now all of these people, all of these young men that work for Nabal, they all know that they owe David their lives. So literally, if there was a situation in which they could protect him, they would. Because they have such gratitude for him. They'll have such gratitude for him. It's also figurative in the sense that as we do good, it's like, hey, that's like this barrier of protection around us. This is something that actually is spoken of in the New Testament as well, right? Here it's very specific, speaking about David and this specific act. But Peter talks about something similar in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, where he says, "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." Here, Peter is encouraging us to keep our conduct honorable among non-believers. Right? When we're out in the world, he's saying, keep your conduct honorable among non-believers so that when they speak against you, all that really, like, your good deeds protect you. Right? Your good deeds, your good reputation protects you because none of those charges can stick because there's no evidence there for them to stick. This is something that Paul takes a step further when he's talking about our leaders. When he's talking about elders in the church, he said they need to be have these certain characteristics. He writes of them in Titus, but also in 1 Timothy, which we'll read here. 1 Timothy chapter 3, 1 through 7. He says, "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, but not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil." I want you to notice two things in that passage. Obviously, a lot of things that he calls us to there. And this is the standard he's setting for elders in the church. He says that they need to be above reproach, meaning that their conduct needs to be so good that it's not impeachable, right? That there's nothing that anyone can even suggest they might have done. And then also they need to be well thought of by outsiders, right? Those two things kind of go hand in hand and speak to this same idea of keeping your conduct honorable in the world. And it's the same idea that it is being told to David here. The good that you do protects you. He's saying that to us here, that our elders need to be above reproach. They need to be well thought of by outsiders so that they're protected by those good deeds, by those good things that they have done. They cannot fall under attack. The charges won't stick. And that's obviously the standard for elders here, that they're holding up this high standard for what elders have to adhere to. But obviously anyone else should aspire to those same things if that is the standard we're holding our leaders to. Abigail says something else to David here that I find interesting. In verse 30, she says that God will do all the good that he has spoken concerning David and make him prince over Israel. Right? She refers to him as that he will become prince over Israel. Now, that's a term referring to the king of Israel, right? He's saying the king of Israel. But up to this point, we've only heard God and Samuel speaking for God refer to that position as prince over Israel. This specific phrase, prince over Israel, prince meaning a leader, right? And it's related to this idea of king, but it's not quite the same thing because it has that implication of there is the true king and then there is the prince. And what Abigail here is doing is referring to it the same way that God himself talks about it. We see it when he first tells Samuel to call Saul to be king, to anoint Saul for the first time. We see it in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 16. He says, "Tomorrow about this time I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall appoint him to be prince over my people Israel." That's how we see God talk about it all the time. He calls it the prince over Israel. And here Abigail says the same thing. She's the first person outside of God or Samuel that we see use this term. And she is showing her recognition of what the king's role is in Yahweh with Yahweh's people. That they are ultimately Yahweh's people. He is ultimately the king. That the prince over Israel is simply his representative. And then in David's response, we see him demonstrate his wisdom, right? He is no fool. David is no Nabal. He listens to her advice. He recognizes that she's a gift from God to him. She kept him from taking vengeance into his own hand. She kept him from bloodshed. If she hadn't intervened, David would have absolutely killed them all. Right, we think back to our image of this as a movie, as a modern day movie, or the montage, or the music getting pumping you up, showing all the soldiers getting armed up and ready, and then the caravan going and the engines revving, and they're heading toward, they're going to go and kill Nabal. Yeah, kill Nabal. Let's get him. Right? And you're like, if you're in the theater, it's like the bass is pumping. You're like, yes, let's go, let's go. And then all of a sudden this woman comes, and she goes, oh, you don't want to do this? You don't want to do this? And we go, okay, come on, get around this lady. And then he says, you're right. You're right, I don't want to do this. It's a terrible movie. That's boring, right? We're just getting to the exciting part. We're just getting to the action. What happened? And all of a sudden it cuts off. But for real life, it's very good, right? For real life, this is wisdom. David is listening to good advice. We'll continue here, lastly, with verses 36 through 44. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, Yahweh struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be Yahweh, who has avenged the insult I received by the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. Yahweh has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife. And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, son of Laish, who was of Galim. So Abigail returns. She's going to tell her husband what she just did, how she just saved his life. But she finds he's in the middle of the feast and he's so drunk that he's not worth talking to. So she waits till morning. In the morning, he's hungover, but he's aware. And so she tells him what happened and how she spared his life, right? These men were coming. They were ready to kill you and everybody else here. But I saved you by giving this small gift to them. And it says Nabal's heart died within him. And we don't know exactly what that means, right? We don't know what is the actual medical thing that was happening to him. It's possible that he had some kind of stroke that paralyzed him and then killed him 10 days later. It's also possible that it was just a supernatural paralysis that comes over him and that then God just strikes him dead 10 days later. It's hard to say exactly what's going on here, but something that paralyzed him immediately upon hearing this news, and then he just dies 10 days later. David hears the news and he praises Yahweh for avenging the insult that he received from Nabal, but he also recognizes the value of Abigail, right? He realizes, hey, now she's a widow. She would make a good wife. His own wife, Michal, had been given to another man, and so Abigail becomes David's wife, which is also a mercy, right? In normal situation, if this widow, she's just going to have a hard life the rest of her life. She's probably not going to remarry. But David recognizes her value and asks her to come and be his wife, and she is overjoyed, right? She says, I'm a servant to wash the feet of your servants. Right? She's so happy. She couldn't have imagined a better situation, right? For Abigail, she already saved the life of this guy whose life was not worth saving. Right? Her husband, there had to be a part of her that wanted to tell David, just get him. Just go kill him. Sick of this guy. Sick of being married to this guy. Right? There was no way this was a happy life for her living with Nabal. So then to go from that to then getting to be married to the future king, right? The one that she believed he would be king, right? She knows that this truth. And so God avenged David by killing Nabal. David offers marriage to Abigail, who wouldn't have never expected to remarry. It's a beautiful love story, right? This is an incredible love story. We thought this was an action movie. It turned into a rom-com, right? And what a beautiful story they have, that Abigail becomes David's wife after she saves him from committing this brutal killing, and then her husband dies, her worthless, harsh, badly behaved husband dies, and now she gets to marry David. What an incredible story. And then it just throws in like, oh, and David married this other girl too. And we're like, well, that really sucks. That really takes the wind out of this. It's like a cool story. And also, like, imagine if you were this other woman, and you're like, you're at a gathering or something, and they're like, well, how did you guys meet? Oh, well, I was working for Abigail's husband, and then I was going to kill him, and she stopped me. It's this cool, awesome story. And then it's like, oh, what about the other two of you? I just married you. I married her too. It's a bummer, right? and like a bummer for us, because we're like, well, David, we like David. He's like a great guy, and we even like, we would have liked to see him try to like go and rescue Michael, as like save the damsel from her evil father or something like that. It might have been cool, but if that's not possible, then at least we have this cool story with Abigail. But then we get this other, he's married 2 women. Why? We don't like that, right? And so let's talk a little bit about what the Bible says about polygamy, because this is something that is often people have a problem with and is often brought up by critics of Christianity. They go, well, there's polygamy in the Bible. If God is so keen on marriage, then how come there's all this polygamy in the Bible? Well, first of all, we have to say that in the New Testament, it's very clear that monogamy is the standard, right? We've just looked at that passage that related to elders. It said that the elder has to be a husband of one wife, right? So that's the standard. That's the policy. In the New Testament, it is clear monogamy is the standard. One man, one woman, that is marriage. That is what God intends. There is a good deal of polygamy in the Old Testament, okay? But we have to take it in context. We need to examine these cases, and if we do so, we'll find that it never goes well, right? There are cases of polygamy in the Old Testament, but if we truly read them and examine the lesson that we might find there, we would find that it's telling us this is a bad idea. So let's just take, for example, real briefly here, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? The forefathers of the faith. Okay, Abraham. Abraham has 2 wives, right? He's got Sarah, his first wife. He's married to her for a long time. They can't conceive, so he ends up going to Hagar, and they have a son together, and then Sarah has a son as well. There's lots of tension, lots of conflict. It goes really badly. There's lots of negativity that happens there. And how many chapters does it take to tell Abraham's story? 12. 12 chapters related to Abraham. Okay? Then we got Isaac. Isaac just marries one woman. They also have trouble conceiving, and they pray about it. And then they have twins, Jacob and Esau, and they just have this beautiful love story. 4 chapters. 4 chapters for Isaac. Then his son Jacob, who's the son of the promise, he ends up marrying 2 women, right? He gets tricked. He ends up marrying 2 women because he gets tricked a little bit. And they have lots of conflict between them and lots of jealousy and strife, and they end up having 12 children because they're like competing for the favor from Jacob. And so there's all this negativity that happens around the fact that he's got these 2 wives. 11 chapters. 11 chapters. Why is Isaac so short? Because it's boring. Because he just does it right. He just does it right. If we look at, and this is true so often in the Old Testament, we have to consider the whole story. We can't just go, well, because it describes this thing, that means it's endorsing this thing. We have to look at what is the outcome of those stories. What is the outcome? What happens as a result of those things? There's lots of times in the Old Testament that you'll read something and it'll just state, this thing happened. And in order to know whether that was good or bad, you have to keep reading until you find out the result of that action to know whether that was good or bad. And when we look at the Old Testament, whenever we see polygamy come up, it tends to create conflict and tension. It does not go well for those families. So that's how I would say it does not endorse polygamy either, just like the New Testament. All right, we'll wrap up with this. 3 takeaways for today's message. Number 1, seek out and listen to wise advice, right? Seek out wise counsel. Ask for advice, ask for help. Be willing to listen. Number 2, live a life that is above reproach, right? Live a life that outsiders would think well of you, that you would not be accused of anything. And then lastly, allow God to fight your battles. And that's what Abigail ends up encouraging David to do, to allow God to avenge him, and he does so. I'm going to pray here in just a minute, and then we're going to take communion together in recognition of Jesus' broken body and shed blood. And then we'll sing a closing song. After that, there'll be a prayer team available over here. If you'd like prayer for anything, they'd love to pray for you. Would you bow with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this morning that we can come together in your name. And God, we thank you for the stories that you provide us in the Old Testament that teach us so much. God, we pray that we would take good advice, that we would even seek it out when we need it, God, that we would seek to live for you, and that we would allow you to fight our battles. Pray these things in Jesus' blessed name. Amen.